In Chapter 5, the very first thing the instance did at noMount was read its initialization parameters. This chapter is about those parameters, where they're stored, and how you change one without shooting yourself in the foot. Now, there are hundreds of parameters, and I promise you no interviewer expects you to memorize them. What they're really testing is whether you understand how parameters are stored and changed, and specifically two things: the difference between the SPFILE and the PFILE, and the meaning of the scope clause. Get those two right, and you sound like someone who's actually run a production database. Let's earn that. Let's define them plainly. When an instance starts, it has to know a bunch of things up front: how big to make the SGA, where to write certain files, how to manage memory. Those settings are called initialization parameters, and remember from Chapter 5 that the instance reads them during the noMount stage. It's the very first thing that happens. There are hundreds of these parameters, but here's the reassuring truth. You only ever tune a handful in real life, and interviewers know that, so they don't quiz you on the list. What they care about is that you understand how the parameters are stored and how you change them safely. That's where the real knowledge lives, so that's where we'll spend our time. Parameters can be stored two ways, and the distinction is a classic question. The older form is the PFILE, a parameter file, a plain text file traditionally named init.sid.ora. You edit it by hand in a text editor, and any change only takes effect at the next startup. The modern form is the SPFILE, the server parameter file, a binary file that Oracle itself manages. Its big advantage is that you change parameters with the alt-system command while the database is running, and Oracle records the change so it survives restarts. So the one-liner is, the PFILE is static and manual, the SPFILE is dynamic and persistent, and production databases use the SPFILE. Keep that phrasing, static and manual versus dynamic and persistent. It's exactly what they want to hear. There's a second split worth knowing. Some parameters are dynamic and some are static. A dynamic parameter can be changed on a running instance, and it takes effect immediately or very soon after, no restart required. A static parameter can only change at startup, so if you want to alter it, you have to bounce the instance. A good example of a static one is a parameter controlling a fundamental memory or process limit. Why does this matter in practice? Because not every change is free. If you promise a team you'll adjust a setting during a 5-minute change window, and it turns out to be static, you now need a full restart you didn't plan for. Knowing which is how you avoid that embarrassing surprise. And it leads perfectly into the star of this chapter, the scope clause. This is the slide that makes interviewers sit up. When you change a parameter and the SPFILE is in use, you choose where the change applies using the scope clause, and there are three options. Scope equals memory changes only the currently running instance, and the change is lost on the next restart. Scope equals SPFILE writes the change to the SPFILE only, so it does nothing right now, but it takes effect at the next startup, and that's exactly how you change a static parameter. And scope equals both, which is the default for dynamic parameters, applies the change immediately and saves it for future restarts. Being able to rattle off those three, what each does now versus after a restart, is one of the most reliable ways to show real depth in this whole topic. Here's the trap, almost word for word how they ask it. How do you change a parameter so it survives a reboot, but you don't want it active yet? A lot of people fumble because they conflate persisting with applying. But you know the answer cold now. Scope equals SPFILE. It writes the change into the SPFILE so it persists across restarts, but it does absolutely nothing to the running instance. It only takes effect at the next startup. That's perfect when you want to stage a change but not apply it live, or when the parameter is static and can't change on a running instance anyway. So train the reflex. The moment you hear persist but don't apply now, your mouth should already be forming the words, scope equals SPFILE. Let's make it concrete. Say you want to grow the shared memory target and keep it after reboot. you'd run alti-system-set-skate-target equals 2g-scope equals both, because sga-tracket is a dynamic parameter. Both applies it to the running instance immediately and saves it into the SP file for the future. Perfect, one command. Done. Now, contrast that with a static parameter, like the maximum number of processes. You can't change that live, so you'd use scope equals SPFILE to stage it, and then shut down and start up to make it take hold. Same alter system command, different scope, because one parameter is dynamic and the other is static. See how the two ideas, dynamic versus static, and the scope clause, click together? That's the whole chapter in one example. Time to prove it. You inspect parameters two ways, and the difference matters. To see the value currently in effect, you use show parameter with the name in SQL+, or you query $parameter. But to see what's actually written in the SP file, which might be different if you use scope equals memory, you query $SPPAmeter. Here's why that distinction is gold. If someone changed a parameter with scope equals memory, the running value and the stored value will disagree, and after a restart, it'll revert. Being able to compare $parameter against $SP parameter lets you catch exactly that. Running value versus stored value, two different views, and knowing both is the mark of someone who's debugged a surprise reboot. Let's lock it in. Initialization parameters are the settings the instance reads at no mount. They're stored two ways. The PFILE is static text, edited by hand, effective at next startup. The SPFILE is binary, changed with alti-system, and persistent, and that's what production uses. Parameters are either dynamic, changeable live, or static, needing a restart. The scope clause controls timing. Memory for now only, SPFILE for next startup, both for now plus persist, which is the default. And the trap, persist, but don't apply yet, means scope equals SPFILE. That wraps the foundations of the instance. Next we cross over to the database side and get physical, the actual files sitting on disk that make up the database. That's Chapter 7.